Our speaker today is a familiar name and face to many of us here at the UW, especially here in the School of Public Health. Howie Frumkin was Dean of School of Public Health from 2010 to 2016 and is Professor Emeritus in DEOHS. His career focuses on health impacts of climate change, the built environment, nature contact, and sustainability. Prior to joining School of Public Health as Dean, Howie served as Director of the National Center for Environmental Health and Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry at the CDC, and Professor and Chair of Environmental and Occupational Health Science and Professor of Medicine at Emory University. Since stepping down as Dean, Howie has served as Senior Vice President at the Trust for Public Land and head of the Our Planet, Our Health initiative at the Wellcome Trust in London. He is an elected member of the Washington State Academy of Sciences and of the National Academy of Medicine and remains an important thought leader in environmental health, serving on the board of the Seattle Parks Foundation and the executive committee of the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement, and as lead author on the health chapter of the Nature Record, and much, much more. Howie is the author or co-author of more than 300 scientific journal articles and chapters, and is the author of 10 books, including the definitive textbook in environmental health and seminal books on the built environment and health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Howard Frumkin.
Thank you, June, for that wonderful introduction. It is so special to be here and see old friends. It's doubly special to be the Omenn Lecture speaker. I don't think this school and this department have any more steadfast friends and supporters than Gil and Martha. So thank you very much. Well, let me set expectations. As June said, my title is Professor Emeritus. And as you know from your Latin class, emeritus is to merit as edentulous is to teeth, or as eviscerated is to viscera. What it means is you used to have it, but you haven't got any more. But what I'm going to lack in merit, I'll make up with pluck as I take you on a journey through changes in the environmental health paradigm over the last generation. And I'm going to start with some personal narrative, my own story coming into this field, because that's what professors emeritus do. So bear with me on that. So I came into this field through the occupational health field. And the images that animated me early in my career were images like the ones you see here. The hazards of musculoskeletal stresses in the upper left, the hazards of toxic chemicals and of injury risks in the upper right. And when I thought about clinically, I thought about things like progressive massive fibrosis on the bottom right, and my dissertation for my doctorate was on asbestos in the bottom left. So these were the kinds of things that I thought about, noxious and dangerous exposures that afflicted workers. And then as my career advanced and I got out of strictly doing occupational health and began to think about the environmental health side of things, it was in some ways more of the same. I thought about frontline communities like you see on the upper left that were dealing with close-up exposures to industrial emissions. I thought about communities exposed to highways with the decrements in air quality that resulted. I thought about communities certainly in low-income countries, but also in this country that were exposed to polluted water. I thought about poor housing. Again, noxious and dangerous exposures. And all of this work, my clinical work, taking care of patients with these exposures, my research, my teaching, was all about how we recognize and quantify and deal with the effects of these noxious and dangerous exposures. But there's a small part of my personality, small but lovingly nurtured, that is oppositional. And I began asking the question, what if we inverted the narrative? Could there be environmental exposures that are not necessarily dangerous, but health promoting? Exposures that don't make people sick, but help them thrive. And of course, the first thing that came to mind was the natural world, the beauties of nature that I enjoyed myself. And I wondered whether there might be a body of evidence suggesting health benefits from nature contact. And I wondered whether we could tell an evidence-based story that would lead to health promotion through this environmental set of interventions. So I began reading the literature. And this was a quarter century ago. I dove into the literature in landscape architecture and in environmental psychology and in the parks and recreation field. There wasn't much in public health or medicine, but other fields had a lot to offer. And so I published a paper almost exactly 25 years ago this month in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, proposing with a little bit of provocativeness and audacity, as you can see in the highlighted line there, maybe we should think about a broader agenda for environmental health encompassing not only toxic outcomes, but also salutary ones. So that was an interesting paper to publish. The journal editor at the time sought a couple of editorials and got editorials from two writers, E.O. Wilson and John Stilgoe. And if you look at their key quotes from their editorials, they both basically say the same thing, which is, we think we need more collaboration between the health fields and the environmental fields so we can pursue this agenda because we think there's something there. What was interesting was that Wilson, of course, was the famous evolutionary biologist. John Stilgoe was a landscape architect. There were no senior health professionals who were in a position to write an editorial. You might have thought in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, there'd be a senior poobah from medicine or public health who could have weighed in, but nobody was really paying attention at that point to this set of issues. So that was kind of an interesting data point. Well, since then, the publications in this field have skyrocketed. And this is from Web of Science, and the search terms I used were green space and health, but you see basically the same pattern with any set of search terms. Lest you think I'm taking credit that my paper had anything to do with this, notice that for the 5-year stretch after the paper was published, the pattern remains flatlined. And apparently neither of the people who read that paper did anything about it. But eventually the field took off, and it's been a fascinating ride over the last 10 or 15 years. In fact, there are so many papers coming out now that it's hard to keep track. And if you scan some of the titles on the papers in this image, you'll see a fascinating range of health outcomes and of populations being studied. Everything from life expectancy to diabetes to behavioral issues. The exposure to nature has been associated with improved health in many of those ways. There's a whole set of books out now, all from the last 10 or 15 years that are shown here. One of the best known is the upper left, Last Child in the Woods by the journalist Rich Louv, who as a journalist has a real gift for turns of phrase. He coined the phrase nature deficit disorder in that book, which has really caught on. He is still at pains to say it's not an official diagnosis, but it sure captures a lot, doesn't it? And a nice thing about this bookshelf full of books is how much our part of the country is represented here. Those 4 books on the bottom right all have homes in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, Eco-Psychology by Peter Kahn from our Department of Psychology, Digging into Nature by Pooja Tendon from our Department of Pediatrics, Brand New Therapeutic Gardens by 2 of our colleagues from Landscape Architecture. And the book on the bottom right is a fantastic book by the storied landscape architect David Camp, who is in the room here somewhere back there. So this reflects that we in this part of the country love the natural world, and we have been energetic about digging into this topic. There are organizations being formed and reaching maturity that are looking at the nature-health interface. The Children in Nature Network on the upper left is about 20 years old now. It's an advocacy group, but very science-based, and they maintain on their website a directory of research on the nature-health connection in kids. The Nature and Health Alliance in the center and the World Society on Forests and Parks for Public Health, the former being more US-based and the latter being more European and Asian-based, have come up in the last 3-4 years. They're academic practitioner networks promoting research and practice on the nature and health connection. Here at UW, we were one of the first centers to get started that contributed to what then became the Nature and Health Alliance. This is our UW Nature and Health Center, a terrific collaboration of people from across the university and the community. And UW authors have been major contributors to this literature on a whole range of topics, as you see here, from sleep to stress to climate adaptation to physical activity. And a real shout out to all of the UW students, staff, and faculty who have contributed to this literature. So we are pretty well all in with this research. It's a thing. It's really a thing within the environmental health field now. How can the natural world promote health? So before I talk about the implications of that thing for the paradigm we think of as environmental health, let me just introduce those who are not familiar with how this science is done. What does it look like? Well, there are true experiments, sometimes even randomized clinical trials, and I'll show you a couple of examples. This was a study of 17 children aged 7 to 12 who had ADHD. They all took in random orders 20-minute guided walks in 3 settings: parks, neighborhoods, in a downtown setting, and were studied with the digit span backwards test before and after the walk. You can see in the diagram, it's pretty visually striking. There was significant improvement in their digit span backwards test, a measure of cognitive performance and attention, after the park walk compared to the non-natural setting walks. This was a study of depression treatment. 147 adults were randomized into 2 groups. One got conventional treatment, the other got conventional treatment plus a program called Flow with Nature, which entailed weekly 90-minute group sessions in a park or forest for 3 months. So not a brief intervention. And the outcomes are shown here. You can see that the groups weren't exactly matched at the beginning, but in the cases of the Beck Depression Inventory and the Core 10, those who walked in natural settings had more improvement than those who had conventional treatment. And the last true experiment I'll show you is a sample looked at gynecologic cancer survivors and immune function as an outcome. One group had meditation classes, the other group had meditation plus an interesting form of nature exposure. They inhaled phytoncides, biogenic compounds that come off of plants that have been hypothesized as immune strengtheners. And in this case, this was a Korean study, but the plant used was the Japanese cypress, and the oil from the cypress was their exposure. It's primarily a terpene-based oil, and they were exposed an hour a day, 5 days a week for 8 weeks. And you can see that in terms of their stress scale, their sympathetic nervous activity, their cortisol, and their natural killer cells, there was improvement in those who inhaled the phytoncides compared to those who didn't. Now, all of these experiments share some common features. They are small, they are short-lived, and they look at acute outcomes. So very useful, but limited in what it can tell us more broadly. The next kind of method is the natural experiment, where alert investigators notice an experiment happening without their intervention and take advantage of it. And the classic example here is Roger Ulrich's study, published in Science magazine in the 1980s. He looked at the post-surgical ward of a suburban Philadelphia hospital, which is shown in the picture. And what he recognized was that after you had your gallbladder out and you were taken to the recovery room, you might be randomly exposed to a view of vegetation if you ended up with a tree view room, indicated by the green arrow. If you didn't end up in that room, you ended up in a room with a view of a brick wall. He recognized that this was a beautiful natural experiment, and he studied the outcomes differing between the 2 groups. What he found was that there was a significantly shorter hospitalization post-operatively if you had a view of trees. And let me pause to just remind us how remarkable it was in the 1980s that you got to stay in the hospital for a week after a gallbladder came out, as opposed to contemporary drive-through methods. You had less use of analgesic medications and you had fewer negative nursing notes. So this became kind of a landmark study, and it's been replicated several times since then. Simply viewing nature through a window seems to have salutary effects and accelerate and improve healing. But most of the evidence we have is observational evidence. So just a couple of examples of that. This is a study from London. London's a great place to do a study. So are the Scandinavian countries, because they have something called a healthcare system. And that's great to have. So through their healthcare system, they actually know who gets prescriptions and where those people live. London also has a tree census. So they were able to look cross-sectionally at the association between the density of antidepressant prescribing, block by block, and the density of street trees, and found that each additional street tree per street kilometer was associated with a 2.4 prescription decrease per 1,000 people per year in antidepressants. Cross-sectional, we need to be very careful about drawing conclusions from studies like this. But when there are dozens of studies that corroborate the findings, we begin to think there is some evidentiary strength there. This was an observational study moving now from England to Northern Ireland. This is the Northern Ireland cohort for the longitudinal study of aging. And this is fairly typical in this field. People who have come into this field have found ongoing cohorts. And this has happened here at UW with some of the cardiovascular cohorts that people here work on. And you can use those as a platform for studying the benefits of nature contact. In this particular case, they looked at measures of neighborhood greenness using two metrics. One is called the NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. It's a satellite image of how green a neighborhood is. And the other is proximity of a home address to green space. And they found that the NDVI was positively associated with the mini mental state exam. That was the outcome of interest. And park distance was negatively associated with the mini mental status exam. So the greener your neighborhood and the closer you live to a park, the better your mental status. So studies like that have led to fairly robust evidence-based conclusions suggesting that nature contact is beneficial in all the ways shown here. Reducing stress, reducing the symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in kids, more pro-social behavior, and these are mostly playground studies showing that kids manage disputes better and form friendships more effectively in green playgrounds than in more stark playgrounds. Reduced aggression and crime, a fantastic set of actually randomized clinical trials in Philadelphia looking at the greening of neighborhood lots and the impact on crime in neighborhoods. Reduced depression and anxiety, improved cognition, improved job and school performance. With regard to physical health, we have fairly robust evidence for all of these outcomes. I won't inflict on you the PowerPoint malpractice of reading to you a slide that you can perfectly well read yourself, but you can see the range of health outcomes here. I think it's the case that if we had a pill that delivered all of these benefits, everybody would be on that pill. So nature is a pretty powerful strategy for health promotion. And it's evolving. Here are some examples of recently published papers, examples of preliminary or fragmentary evidence showing that nature offers the benefits shown here: fewer premenstrual symptoms, lower mortality in people with diabetes, lower suicide rates, and so on. This is a thing. What does it mean for the environmental health paradigm? I'm going to suggest that our paradigm has changed a lot with the introduction of interest and research in the health benefits of nature contact. In some ways, simply a small adjustment. In other ways, maybe a real phase change in the way we think about our field. So these are the 6 changes that I want to talk about with you. Exposure assessment. So everybody in the environmental health field knows that exposure assessment is fundamental to the research that we do. You can't quantify the association between an exposure and an outcome unless you can quantify that exposure. Exposure assessment, when I was coming into the field, involved either looking at personal exposure assessment, like the individual monitoring you see on the left, or area measurements like you see on the right, biomonitoring like blood lead samples. We measured the noxious and dangerous things and then looked to associate those with the outcome in which we were interested. If you flip that and you ask, how do you measure nature? Well, one method is what I mentioned before, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, satellite imagery of how green a neighborhood is. One method is how close you live to a green space like a park. So you can actually measure the 10-minute walk to a park, which is something we did at my position at Trust for Public Land. This is the park score image for Seattle. Turns out that over 95% of Seattleites live within a 10-minute walk of a park, so we score very high on this particular metric. But you can identify either for any individual or for a community the proportion of people who live within a 10-minute walk of a park, and that can be an exposure metric. Compliance with the 330-300 rule. Now, this is a rule that's been proposed in the last 5 years or so, suggesting that for urban planners and urban elected officials, what they should aim for is that everybody should be able to view 3 trees out the window of home. Everybody should live near or within an area with 30% tree canopy cover, and everybody should live within 300 meters of the nearest park. The 330-300 rule. This is proposed as a benchmark for what constitutes a good neighborhood. And the level of compliance with this rule can be an exposure measure. You can appreciate that when you think about the NDVI, what the satellite sees, that may be very different than what you see as you walk along the street. So we've been moving toward Google Street Views and similar metrics where you actually move a vehicle along a street. You take in the level of vegetation that's visible at the street level. You use AI to process that, and you come up with a measure of the greenness that a person actually experiences walking along the street. There are composite measures like nature score. Some of you may be familiar with walk score, which is widely used in studies of the built environment. Nature score is kind of a replica that measures through a multidimensional index that you can't actually get into because AI generates it and constantly changes it. And it may be a commercial protected thing, but it's becoming more widely used. You can pop in your address and you can get the nature score. So the picture I'm showing you here is this building, and we have a nature score of 28.9, which they, I think, diplomatically call, what does it say there? Nature light. It's very little nature here. But if you come over to Bainbridge Island, where I live, we have scores in the 90s pretty regularly because we live near lots of greenery. So a composite measure like this. You can also measure how much time people spend in natural settings. It's easy to track people with smartphones these days. And so this is a really useful exposure metric. And the last that I'll mention, although there are many more I could mention, is perceived exposure to nature. And this is really interesting. You can ask people, how much nature do you think you got? And people can tell you what they think they got. And that may be very different than the objective measures would suggest they got. But this is a paper just published by Taylor Ricketts and colleagues at University of Vermont. What you can see in the inset box there is different colors representing 4 different metrics of nature exposure. The brown is perceived nature exposure, and the lower 3 are objective measures of nature exposure. And what you see for each of the outcomes shown on the graph is that perceived nature exposure is strongly associated with the outcome, and the objective measures are not at all. This is a dramatic example. It's probably not the case that the 2 findings are so disparate so much of the time. But it does remind us that unlike, say, asbestos or benzene, where how much exposure you perceive you're getting probably isn't as telling as how much you actually got. With nature contact, a lot of this effect may be mediated by perceptions and individual reactions. So, lots of options for exposure assessment, a whole range of possibilities that really don't come up in the measurement of noxious and dangerous exposures. And what's challenging about this and tough is that we don't actually have a standard definition of nature. You might be sitting there pondering now, how would I define nature? What is it? And in particular, what's the active ingredient in nature that I should be measuring? A lot of those measures that I showed you presume that our contact with nature is visual. You walk down the street and you see trees. But what if it's olfactory? What if it's tactile? What if it's auditory? What if it's completely non-sensory? It has to do with inhalants that you're inhaling without knowing it. So we don't actually know what we should be measuring to get the best, most precise, most meaningful metric of exposure. We don't know the relevant pathways. Again, is it olfactory? Is it visual? Is it tactile? And there is considerable inter-individual variability. So if 2 of us get the same dose of asbestos or benzene, we know there are differences. In fact, with the gene-environment interaction work that's emerged in the last couple of decades, we know a lot about those differences. But that set of differences probably pales in comparison to the individual differences in response to nature, about which more in just a few minutes. Second change in our paradigm, outcome assessment. I'll be very brief here. Lots of the outcomes that we study are the same as the outcomes we study in conventional environmental health, physical activity, immune function, attention, cancer, heart disease. But there are some other outcomes relevant to the health and well-being benefits of nature that are a lot more tricky to study. Awe. How many people here have felt a sense of awe in a natural setting at some time in your life? So almost every hand is up. It's a described phenomenon, and it may be part of the pathway to nature benefit. But boy, it's tough to measure, isn't it? Happiness is tough to measure, although probably the best measure is simply asking people how happy they are. They tend to know. And well-being is a multidimensional, tough thing to measure too. So we have different outcomes that we need to think about with nature contact than with traditional toxic exposures. Inter-individual variability. I'm going to tell you the story of 5 people who all go to one of the great Seattle parks and spend an hour. Person number 1 doesn't like it much in the park, feels hot, feels sweaty. She runs into a bee's nest. She flees. That's a bad day at the park. People number 2 go to the park, but they're spending the whole time with their faces in their smartphones. They're scrolling through emails or whatever they scroll through and aren't paying any attention at all. They're oblivious to what's around them. Scenario 3, these kids are playing in the park and they're actually using the tree in the same way they would use a jungle gym in an indoor facility, but they may be appreciating the fact that they're using a tree. It's kind of background for them, but it's part of their encounter. Situation number 4, here's a young future scientist. He's a future DEOHS student who is cognitively very engaged as he studies the nature that he sees there. And here's somebody doing forest bathing who's not only cognitively engaged, but spiritually and emotionally engaged. All of these people have 1 hour in Discovery Park. Don't you think the impact of that 1 hour, which is equivalent exposure to nature, is going to be very different? So we are quite different in what we bring to nature contact and in the way we process our experiences. And that is a thorny challenge in the research that we do. There's a concept called nature connectedness, and people measure it with scales, sometimes called nature relatedness. And some of the scales are shown here. This is an emotional affiliation with nature that has been shown in some studies to be a mediator of the benefits that nature provides. Now, there's no such thing as asbestos connectedness or benzene connectedness. So in this sense, this nature domain is a paradigm change for the environmental health field. How do you measure nature connectedness? Well, typically it's by survey. And this is an example of one of the surveys that's used. The panel in the upper right shows a complete disconnectedness, calling to mind Woody Allen's famous line, "Nature and I are two," all the way to the bottom right, where people feel deeply enmeshed in and engaged with the natural world. And it turns out that self-reported, self-perceived level of nature connectedness is an individual feature, an attribute that may be on the pathway to some of the benefits that nature provides. Issue number 4, avoiding type 1 errors. So I think everybody knows this, but just as a reminder, a type 1 error is a false positive. It happens when we conclude that a hypothesis is true when it's really false. And we like to avoid false positive conclusions because we have in the healthcare world a long history of bad mistakes where we accepted as true hypothesized associations that were very untrue. You can see many examples of those things here. Well, because of that humbling history, we have taken pains to avoid false positive conclusions. And that pain comes with the worship of the p is less than 0.5 threshold. That means that we will only accept a conclusion if it's 95% or more unlikely to have happened by chance. So that's a pretty stringent criterion. Well, I would argue to you that we may want to rethink that in the context of nature contact. The picture on the left is a set of pills. If we mistakenly conclude that they work and give them to people, we can do a lot of damage. Picture on the right is a walk in a natural setting. If we mistakenly tell people that it's good for them and they go out and walk in the natural setting, There might be some mosquito bites or sunburn, but unlikely to do a lot of harm. So we may actually want to rethink our threshold for evidentiary strength in this field, and that would be a paradigm shift. Full benefit accounting. When we do a study of asbestos, let's say we're testing the hypothesis that asbestos causes mesothelioma, that is a pretty self-contained study. And if we determine that the asbestos causes the mesothelioma, we can draw the conclusion and call it a day. I think things are different in the realm of nature contact. We do know that nature contact is likely to improve health, as indicated here and as I've been carrying on about. But think of all the other benefits that nature contact delivers. Increased social capital, venues for physical activity, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and so on. If we want fully to understand the social benefits of nature contact, we probably want to expand the scope of our health studies to look at multidimensional benefits. We want to be much less narrowly focused than we have been, going back to the Stilgo and Wilson recommendations for a lot more collaboration across fields and ways of thinking. These things are so important that I want to dive into a couple of them with you for just a minute. Social connections. It turns out that parks and green spaces are great places for people to get with each other. People's social barriers fall a little bit. Conversations happen. People strike up friendships with each other, even if it's shallow social capital, just a quick hello. That's a good thing. And there's a lot of research showing that this is one of the benefits of parks and green space. You can see that I've, as I tend to do on slides, I've festooned this slide with some of the headlines from some of the studies that show you some of these results. Not only one-on-one social contacts, but intergroup contact. And this goes back to Gordon Allport's early sociology in the 1950s, where he described a phenomenon called intergroup contact. And this is especially important to me, I think, because of the polarization and factionalization and tribalism that bedevils our country right now. If parks and green spaces are venues where very different groups can come together and find common ground, that would be really important to know and to promote. Allport said that intergroup contact is likely to go well and lead to more solidarity and less prejudice if the four conditions that you see here hold. The groups have relatively equal status, they have means of cooperation, they share goals, and the authorities support them. To a greater or lesser extent, you can imagine many of these things being woven into park programming to help promote intergroup contact. Intergroup contact can happen through park programming that is relatively structured, like the class that you see in the upper left. A little more informal, like the people running together, sports teams like you see in the bottom right, ethnic festivals, national festivals where people share their food and music and customs with each other. These are natural settings where these things naturally can happen, and these are good for society. Climate solutions. We need lots of climate mitigation. We need lots of climate change adaptation. If you have any questions on any of that, Jeremy Hess is sitting over there and you can talk to him afterwards. This is a kind of a cartoonish depiction of some of the strategies that advance climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And notice one that is in the overlap group there. It's increase in urban green areas, which advances both mitigation and adaptation. Indirectly helps health, but think of it as just a climate strategy. Here are a couple of examples of how that works. The map on the left is New York City. You may recognize some of the parks there. I'll label them for you. Central Park there, Prospect Park, Highland Forest. And look at the temperature color scheme. The blue, cooler temperatures extend in a penumbra blocks out from each of those parks. Urban tree canopy is a great strategy for cooling cities down during extreme heat. The picture on the right is the Rodney Cook Park in Atlanta. This is in a traditionally underserved, underinvested area, African-American community with perpetual flooding in the homes there every time there's a heavy rainstorm. So the park went in and it's designed as a stormwater capture facility. So when it rains heavily, The park captures thousands of gallons of water, and the flooding in the local homes has diminished greatly. When it's not raining heavily, this is a recreational facility for the neighborhood. So it's a double solution to two different problems. The NRDC has done calculations on the potential capacity of forests and other natural settings to absorb carbon, and it's enormous. I won't take you through the numbers here, but by protecting and managing and restoring forests and other natural venues, and that includes wetlands and peatlands and grasslands, we can sequester a substantial proportion of the carbon that we need to sequester. And the last thing I want to say about full benefit accounting is the economic benefits of parks and green space. I'm focusing a lot on parks and green space rather than talking about nature more broadly, because we are a fairly urban society. In fact, the world is a fairly urban world. Most of us live in metro areas. So although a lot of the nature is out there in the national parks and the grasslands and so on, a lot of our nature contact happens on a more local, small scale within cities, parks and green space. Both with local parks and with urban and community forests and with the landscape scale doses of nature, economic benefits flow in all the ways that you see listed here. So for social connectedness, for climate action, for economic benefits, lots and lots of benefits other than health that have to be added to the health benefits. This is a map that shows the proportion of the state budget that is accounted for by the outdoor recreation industry. And it's substantial. This is a real contributor to the economy nationally. So lots of benefits other than health. And if we want to understand fully how we benefit from nature, we will continue to be health researchers and health advocates as we are, but we will team up with people from other sectors so that we can fully describe benefits and drive policy in a more comprehensive and informed way. Ecosystem services. This is the model from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which for reasons unknown to me is abbreviated the MA, leaving out the E. The MA is probably the best model out there for quantifying and tabulating all of the benefits of nature. And just to wrap up this full benefit accounting point, you'll see that in the box on the right, health is one of the sets of outcomes, but one of many. So when I say nature is good for health, the answer is yes, and lots more benefits to think about. And I want to end with talking about the human-nature relationship, which is something that rarely comes up in traditional toxicologic or environmental epidemiologic thinking, but it's intrinsic to thinking about the nature-health connection. Reciprocity is a word that has arisen a lot in the literature in the last 5 or 10 years. It draws on indigenous wisdom, on traditional tribal ways of knowing, on lots of religious traditions, and it suggests that our relationship with nature may need to be reset from the transactional exploitative role that has characterized much of the Industrial Revolution and beyond up to the present, to a more reciprocal and nurturing relationship. We don't ask questions like that when it comes to asbestos or benzene or lead. But it's within this set of relationships, setting the right relationship with nature, that the benefits of nature emerge. So there's lots of respect in the literature, as there should be, for tribal wisdom when it comes to the right relationship with the natural world. And it's probably the case that if we are in that right relationship with the natural world, we benefit more from the nature contact that we have. This is a table of which you're not expected to memorize, and it won't be on the quiz, of relational values of biophilia. This came out of E.O. Wilson's work, and it's an inventory of the values that people bring to their relationship with the natural world, with biodiversity and with nature. And what you can see there is that this has been carefully thought through and tested. And the sets of values that we invoke that guide the relationships we have are an important part of the human relationship with nature in which the health benefits reside. So I've talked about 6 domains that I think differentiate the nature and health world from the traditional environmental health world. There's absolutely nothing wrong, let me be clear, with careful, rigorous studies of the toxic impacts of lead and pesticides and asbestos. We need those things. But as we broaden our paradigm and we take on new challenges like new forms of exposure assessment, diving into the human-nature relationship, that expands our field and pivots us toward things that, at least when I was in school 25, or more than that, 50 years ago, we didn't think about. And that, I think, is an exciting new frontier for our field. Thank you very much. Open for questions. And I don't know who can see who's online, but is somebody watching to see if any of our Zoomers have questions?
Hi, thank you so much. I loved all of that. It was really great. You mentioned that people can have different exposures in nature and that can affect the benefit that they reap from that experience. I was also wondering, though, if there's been any research on whether or not people might have some like intrinsic, I wrote a note of nature requirements. So like maybe for me, I feel like I need a lot of nature to feel happy, but maybe someone else, a friend that I'm thinking of, doesn't feel like going to the park like ever. So I was just wondering if there's been any studies like that of having like the same experience in nature, and if between people there's factors that affect that variability.
That's a great question. It's a question about nature connectedness and nature requirement. So there's actually been some research looking at how much nature you need to get, how much nature exposure you need to get to enjoy the benefits that it delivers. And the number that people usually talk about is, I think it's 120 minutes a week. But that's an average number across a population. And you're asking about whether people differ in their requirement, which wouldn't be surprising at all. We differ in our requirements for lots of things, but we don't have any evidence on that yet. And it's really interesting to ask the question, how would you study that? The answer might be embedded in your question, that you know how much you need, and other people know how much they need. But there are follow-on questions, right? So if we could deepen people's connection with nature so that their need increases and the benefit that they derive increases, that might be a good thing. So lots of derivative questions to ask about that. It is true that nature connectedness is not a fixed variable. So if you had more time outdoors with your family in childhood, you were going to be a more nature connected adult. So it's a fungible variable, and people may differ. People may be changeable over time, and it may be that changing actually benefits people, but we still need a lot of research to understand that better. Thanks for the question.
Over here. Hi, Howie.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Melanie Roberts, Washington State Academy of Sciences. Thanks to one of our members and former board member. I was struck by a couple things. One is that you really asked a question in a different way. And I love that, challenging us to not just go in and ask what our professors asked and the people before us, but really ask a very new question that nobody's asking. And 5 years isn't too long of a lag between publishing a paper and people catching on. So congrats to you and thank you for asking the question. As a personal story, not story, but E.O. Wilson also made me go into neuroscience because he wrote a book saying that that was the consilience of all the disciplines, physics and arts and science and everything. So that's why I went into neuroscience. Question on your work. How does this, I was struck by, this isn't just about time spent outdoors. It's time in green space really makes a difference. So makes me wonder how this translates to deserts and tundra and other landscapes. What do you know about that?
Yeah, great question. So what forms of nature work? Do you need vegetation? Do you need trees or do shrubs do the trick? Which is a question I posed in a talk like this with Laura Bush sitting in the front row, and it was really a bad like a foot and mouth moment. And do deserts do the trick? Do seashores do the trick? These are places that aren't very green. They score low on the NDVI, but they may be a plenty good dose of nature for people. What if you grew up in a desert setting and that's your native habitat, and then you come to the Pacific Northwest and your natural surroundings are different? Does it still work for you? Do you need to change? What if you are exposed to a facsimile of nature, like a virtual reality headset that shows you nature? There's a lot of research going on that now. And you may cringe, but for institutionalized populations, for people who can't get outside, it seems like the answer is it's better than nothing, but not as good as the real thing. So nature representations, as well as various forms of nature, all raise this interesting question of, what's the mechanism? What's the pathway? What's the active ingredient? And the more we know that, the more we can actually optimize the benefits of nature. So thank you for unpacking the question of what is the nature to which we're exposed.
I was just going to really follow on to that. Lauren Jenks with the Washington State Department of Health. I'm curious about how the studies showing that your contact with your pet lowers your blood pressure and is, generally good for you. Is that because my pet is wonderful, or is it because my pet is part of nature? Does that animal contact, do you think, connect to some of the studies you're looking at with green spaces?
Yeah, it's a adjacent but different literature, and no surprise, there's a lot of health benefit to both domestic animals and to viewing wildlife. Rich Louv, the guy who wrote Last Child in the Woods, has a later book which is all about the human-animal bond. It's one of many books on that topic. So the answer is yes. We really like contact with animals. Again, as in the previous discussion, it varies person to person. You've got cat people and you've got dog people and you've got I hate animals people. Yeah.
This is kind of getting that question. Has anybody looked at auditory exposures, like to the sound of the ocean or crickets or bird song?
So for those online, let me repeat the question. Has anybody looked at auditory pathways? Fascinating question. And the answer is yes. One of my favorite studies of all times in this field was a blinded study where people took a walk along a forest path. There were microphones hidden along the path, or loudspeakers hidden along the path. And in one condition, birdsong was broadcast. In the other condition, it wasn't. And people were then asked at the end how restored and how reduced their stress, how restored they felt and how much their stress was reduced. There was a substantial improvement if the birdsong was audible. And they didn't know that it was, and the people weren't told about this. So it was truly a blinded study. So one of the interesting features of this literature that I refer to is that it almost all presumes visual contact is the pathway, but auditory pathways certainly matter. Anybody who's used aromatherapy knows that olfactory pathways have an impact on people. So maybe the smell of rain or the smell of the ocean can be part of the benefit story. We just don't know. And what's especially interesting to me is that there are senses that we don't even know about that may act. So, birds navigate because they can detect magnetic fields. What are over the several 100,000 years or longer of our existence as a species, over the 2 million or so years of our evolution in the genus Homo, what are the connections with nature that we may be unaware of now that may operate? So I think one of the most interesting sets of research questions is going beyond the visual to other potential pathways of contact and understanding how they work.
Yeah. Hi. Everyone else said that. I'm Elizabeth. I go here. I don't do any polls right now. So I know a lot of your work is focusing on the benefits that green space can provide, but I was wondering if you knew of any ongoing work or you were involved in looking at how maybe the destruction of like a natural space is impacting people. When you were mentioning perceived health, it made me think of soul nostalgia and the perceived destruction of one's natural landscape. And so how in the threat of with a changing policies and stuff like that, how I don't know if anything's going on there.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's sort of the reverse dark side of this whole story, that if nature is good for people, and to the extent that people feel connected to it and derive benefits psychically or physically from it, the destruction of that nature is liable to be bad for people. And there is this phenomenon that you mentioned called solastalgia. And for those who don't know the word, it's a made up word, but it comes from a Australian philosopher named Glenn Albrecht. And it refers to the grief that people feel with the loss of beloved places, which for him is a little broader than nature, but it's mostly focused on nature. So if you grew up next to a forest and you watch the forest be cut down for housing development, there's a sadness that goes with that. And more broadly, climate anxiety and climate depression are closely related, because as you see planetary systems degrading, some of that same grief can set in. So that's probably one of the arguments. I don't know if it's an argument, but in my view anyway, it's a strong basis for advocacy for the protection of natural systems. People benefit from them and love them. We are in relationship with them. And when we lose them, we lose something important. On this topic, I should mention, if you're not tired of going to afternoon and evening talks, Robert McFarland is speaking tomorrow night at Town Hall Seattle on his book, Is a River Alive? And it goes into solastalgia, and it goes into the human relationship with river systems. He travels around the world and looks at 3 river systems and explores what it means for people to be in relationship with those rivers. He thinks a river is alive, and he uses a slightly jarring literary device, which is he refers to the rivers with human pronouns throughout the book, which kind of messes with your mind as you read it. He's a wonderful speaker and a wonderful writer. And it dives into this question of what is our relationship with nature? How do we protect what we love and need? And how do we grieve what we're losing? I think Lisa's bringing the microphone around.
Howie, thank you. That was a terrific talk. A sort of simple question. How do we build bridges? The School of Design is literally right across the street. How can they become part of the research that's going on here?
You said with
the School of Design is literally right across the street. How do we get designers, landscape architects, understanding the kinds of things that's being studied here?
Boy, I thank you. I'll see you and raise you one. How do we get environmental psychologists and park administrators and wildlife experts and teachers on and on to team up with health professionals so that we have a holistic approach and bring all of the expertise to bear that we need? And I don't know that I have an answer, but I think each of us reaching out across disciplinary boundaries, getting outside our comfort zone, when your career has exemplified that better than anybody's. David is a landscape architect who has worked a lot in healthy landscape design, both in institutions and in broader contexts. I love reaching out to landscape architects and urban planners for the same reason. So I think sort of normalizing the idea that we need to get outside our discipline and doing that in an academic setting like this, where students can see that it's possible, encouraging joint degree programs, as we have here at UW, and encouraging collaborative work, encouraging de-siloing of city governments. Many city governments have a planning department here and a parks department here and a health department here, and they never talk with each other. But if you think about breaking down those boundaries, as some very enlightened mayors do, that helps a lot with more composite policy. But then I would turn the question back to you and say, do you have any other tricks that have worked for you? And because dialogue and collaboration. Yeah.
We have several online questions, so I'm going to pivot over to Zoom if that's okay.
And then Dr. Omenn has a hand up. So
okay, and then we'll head back over there. Do you think this has a direct implication and relationship to ecologically dimensioned care and thinking about exposure-informed care? Would you say that stewarding well the resources we are gifted would be a good way to think about reciprocity?
Wow. So I think there were at least two parts of that question, if I can deconstruct it a little bit. One is the question of using these principles in care, and the other is stewardship and reciprocity. So there is a whole set of practices that use nature to provide care, either mental health care or other kinds of care. And it's really promising. It's a little hard to read the literature and interpret it because a lot of the studies will tend to be studies published by people who have their own programs and trumpet the benefits of their programs and may not be very rigorous methodologically. But the field of eco-psychology, that was one of the books that I showed in that picture of lots of books, is a robust field. There is nature-based therapy for lots of specific groups like people suffering PTSD, people grieving, people with ADHD, and we have pretty solid evidence that nature-based therapies work for a lot of those groups. So yes to the question of using these findings, preliminary as some of them are, in providing care. And on the question of reciprocity and stewardship, I think they go hand in hand. In fact, I usually use both words together, because if we have a relationship of reciprocity with the natural world, then we're called on to care for it. It's much more like the relationship we have with our siblings or our children or our parents than like a source of resources. And stewardship flows naturally from that.
So thank you, Howie. That was really a very stimulating talk. I wanted to highlight another activity. It's taking root, especially in the context of sounds and the interaction with the environment. And that is the power of music. In fact, the National Institutes of Health has launched a program on music and mental health. It's co-led by the celebrated soprano Renee Fleming and Francis Collins, late of the NIH. And there's ample evidence that this has a role in people's normal feeling, normal sense of themselves, normal appreciation for others and for the environment. It's all connected, I think. And it's particularly valuable because there's so many different kinds of music and so many things that can be measured. Renee Fleming is the main editor on a book about this thick of chapters by scientists, neuroscientists mostly, not environmental scientists, but could be. And I think there's an opportunity to really bridge something significant with them.
Thank you. I completely take your point. And a really interesting example of that, Gil, is some of the music that entrains natural sounds. So people may know the Paul Winter Consort, who did a series of albums using whales, whale sounds as background to the music. And it's fascinating to listen to. And it's in a strange way, it's very soothing. I would hypothesize, on the other hand, that bagpipes don't do it. The missing link between noise and music. Are we doing time? I saw you looking at your watch.
Yeah,
okay.
I sure did. We're at time. Any final thoughts that you'd like to add?
Well, I like presenting on this topic because I think it touches people in a way that some of our other environmental health topics may not. Let me do a quick poll. This is not an epidemiologic study, and I don't have IRB permission, but raise your hand if in the last couple of months you have gone to a beautiful natural place and felt restored and felt better. So I think every hand is up. So this is it's kind of one of the nice things about this topic is that it takes what we know intuitively, gives it a little bit more rigor and form, and inspires us to ask questions like, okay, how do we understand it well enough that we can actually be deliberate about optimizing the benefits that nature provides, and maybe even going a step farther and resetting our relationship with nature so that we truly become good stewards and caretakers. That's going to help not only our health, but it's going to help the planet and our children and our grandchildren. Thank you very much for the chance to be with you.